I'm Lauren Hale, 29, and the night the lights of Manhattan threw diamonds across a ballroom floor, I stood at the edge of it all, hands steady, even as my heart kept time like a drum in my throat. My father smiled for cameras. He'd personally invited my mother hovered close, and my sister shone beneath the chandeliers like the star they raised her to be. A string quartet swelled, waiters floated past with silver trays, and the stage was set for an announcement everyone seemed to know but me. I felt the buzz of it traveling from table to table, the kind of excitement reserved for coronations and lifetime awards. Someone laughed. Crystal chimed, and for one suspended breath, it hit me that my whole life had been training for this moment in reverse, learning how not to be seen. I adjusted the hem of my dress, the same blue I'd worn once before, and made a quiet promise to myself I would not shrink. By the time the music softened and the microphones warmed, I knew a line was waiting to be crossed. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when it would have been easier to stay silent, hit that like and subscribe so we can get through this together. I was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, where the streets are shaded by old trees and the houses keep their secrets behind brick walls and polished doors. Inside ours, the rules were simple. Excellence earns love, and love is measured in headlines and handshakes. My father Thomas believed order kept a family strong, and order meant seats at the long walnut table were as fixed as the portraits on the wall. My mother Diane kept everything shining and smooth, her smile gentle as she corrected her words, light as she compared. And then there was Charlotte, bright, brilliant, bound for the best rooms in the best school center stage, from the moment she learned to hold a violin bow and a debate card in the same week. I learned early to notice what didn't get said. At dinner, my father asked Charlotte about her presentations, and papers ask after ask, as though each report card were a deed to the future. My mother passed the bread and passed along another soft suggestion that I might wake earlier, try harder, reach further. I worked morning shifts in a cafe where the smell of ground beans settled into my clothes, then stacked cans on a grocery aisle after school because it seemed right to pay for whatever pieces of myself I could. I'd tuck tips into an envelope and imagine a small life that belonged to me, a studio with sunlight and a table where conversation didn't feel like walking uphill in heavy shoes. If there was a place I rested, it was my grandfather's porch in Boston. Arthur McKinley had built the family company out of long days and longer patience, and when he retired, he traded boardrooms for lilacs and a stack of well-thumbed books. He'd pour tea, ask what I loved, and let me search for the answer without watching the clock. He never weighed me against my sister, never held a scale in his eyes. He studied the edges of what made me me, and called them steady, called them strong. I'd ride the train back to Connecticut with the sweetness of lilacs in my hair and the feeling that I wasn't invisible, not everywhere, not to everyone. Back home, the house kept its rhythm. Charlotte's victories turned into gatherings that spilled from the dining room into the hall, our mantel crowded with glossy photographs where my presence trailed off at the edge of the frame. When company came, I learned the choreography: greet, slip away, fix what's empty, return, with a smile that kept the water smooth. On afternoons when the driveway filled with black cars and the foyer bloomed with flowers, I'd be the one asked to double-check place cards to fetch the extra napkins to be sure everything sat exactly where it should. It wasn't cruel in the way stories sometimes are. It was ordinary, and the ordinary kind can be the heaviest to carry. What shaped me most wasn't the wealth around me, but the difference between glitter and grace. Grandfather called integrity a habit, not a headline, and I kept that close when the house shifted toward whatever spotlight Charlotte stepped into next. When my mother wondered aloud why I couldn't follow my sister's discipline, I swallowed the answer and saved my breath for places where it mattered. When my father said the future of McKinley Hale Group depended on the sharpest mind in the family, I heard a door close and reminded myself that doors are not the only way out of a room. It was a quiet way to live careful and small, but it kept me whole. The first real crack ran through an ordinary evening a winter night when candles threw soft circles across the table. Charlotte recapped a lecture that turned into an invitation my parents applauded, and my father lifted his glass to the next chapter. I tried to mention something small, nothing much, Just the kind of thing you say when you want to be part of the moment, but conversation slid past like a river flows around a stone. I felt it then, the heat in my face, and the simple knowledge that habits become truths if you let them. I cleared plates, stacked silverware, and told myself the same thing I had promised on the train back from Boston: keep going. The city drew a line under everything when a date circled on my mother's calendar and stayed there like a bell. Charlotte's birthday was to be more than candles. It would be a statement elegant and public, the kind of night people remember because they read about it afterward. The invitations made their way to names I'd grown up hearing in my father's study, and the floral plan looked like spring performed on a stage. I was handed a thick stack of charts with a reminder not to misplace a single card. No one asked what I planned to wear, so I smoothed the same blue dress and let the fabric settle where it could. The morning we drove into the city, the car felt full even with room to spare. My parents rehearsed greetings. Charlotte practiced her smile in the window's reflection, and I watched the skyline push up from the horizon, like a promise I couldn't yet name. At the hotel, chandeliers caught light and made more of it, and I stepped where I was needed, adjusting a name, fixing a fold, breathing through the hum that builds before a downbeat. By nightfall, the ballroom doors opened on cue, and 100 conversations rose into one bright sound. Somewhere between the strings and the footsteps, I sensed the shape of what was coming without knowing its words. When the music dipped and my father reached for the microphone, I took a breath and held it, because some announcements change a life simply by being spoken. The ballroom shimmered with gold light, and the air hummed with the kind of expectation that makes your chest feel tight. My father stood at the microphone. The gleam of confidence settled across his face, as if he'd been rehearsing for this moment his entire life. Behind him, my mother's smile shone as steady as the crystal chandeliers overhead. Guests leaned forward, waiting for whatever grand announcement had gathered them here. I already knew what it would be before he said a word. My father raised his glass and called Charlotte forward, his voice deep and certain as he spoke about her achievements, her leadership, her future. Every sentence built like a drumbeat until he finally said the words that struck through the noise of clinking glasses. Charlotte will inherit the McKinley-Hale Group in full. The company, the estate, the legacy, it all belongs to her. Applause erupted so loud that it swallowed the music. People rose to their feet, cheering as though they'd witnessed history itself. My sister took the stage, her sequined gown catching the light in flashes that made her seem almost untouchable. My mother dabbed at her eyes, proud tears shining like jewels. I sat still, the blue dress I'd chosen feeling smaller by the second, its fabric stiff under my fingers. My father's voice rolled through the room, smooth and practiced, telling everyone how proud he was of his brilliant firstborn, how the company's future couldn't be in better hands. Each word fell like a stone into a quiet pool, rippling outward until I could barely breathe. When he finally lowered the microphone, my mother stepped forward with a velvet box in her hands. Inside was a set of keys, their silver surface winking beneath the lights. "For your new car, sweetheart," she said into the mic, her tone warm, rehearsed. "Your father insisted." The guests laughed, the sound easy and admiring. My father added, "And the Manhattan property deed will be transferred next week." The room broke into a wave of congratulations, cameras flashing, champagne glasses raised. I watched from the far end of the table, my hands folded so tightly in my lap that the knuckles whitened. No one looked my way. I could have slipped out then, and no one would have noticed. But I stayed seated, half in disbelief, half unwilling to move. My father caught my eye for one brief second, then smiled in a way that wasn't quite kind. "And Lauren," he said, the microphone catching his voice clearly, "let's not forget her. She's doing something creative, I believe." Laughter rippled through the tables, polite and light, but cutting all the same. I forced a smile, a small one that never reached my eyes, and lowered my gaze to the tablecloth. The applause swelled again, this time louder, sealing my place as a footnote in my sister's story. I had lived through moments like this before, smaller, quieter, hidden inside family dinners and social events, but never so public, never with hundreds of witnesses watching the contrast so clearly. My father clinked his glass against Charlotte's toasting to the next generation. My mother leaned in to whisper something to a board member, her laughter soft and elegant. Charlotte stood tall, accepting hugs, shaking hands, her future mapped out neatly before her. The orchestra began a lively tune, and the crowd flowed toward the dance floor like water finding its level. I stayed where I was, the noise fading until it felt distant, muffled, as if I were sitting behind glass. The hotel staff swept through with trays of dessert, their movements swift and precise. A waiter paused near me to replace an empty glass and murmured something polite, but I barely heard him. The scent of roses and champagne hung thick in the air. My thoughts kept circling the same truth: this wasn't new. It was only the latest scene in a story that had played on repeat since childhood. I had been the helper, the quiet one, the invisible shadow who kept things running smoothly behind the curtain. Even now, when I looked down the long line of tables, I saw my name missing from every plan, every future my parents described. I glanced toward the back of the room where the wide doors stood open to a corridor of marble and mirrors. The thought of leaving flickered through me like a brief spark of rebellion, but my legs stayed rooted. Then, through the swirl of gowns and tuxedos, I noticed a man striding across the floor. He moved differently, no smile, no champagne in hand, no hesitation in his step. His suit was dark, sharply cut, his presence quiet but commanding. He didn't glance toward the stage or the crowd. His eyes were locked on me. At first I thought he must have mistaken me for someone else. But when he stopped in front of my table, the noise around us seemed to dim. He reached into his jacket, drew out a thick white envelope, and set it gently beside my plate. His voice was low but clear. "It's time, Miss Hale," he said. "Your grandfather wanted this delivered tonight." My breath caught in my chest. I looked down at the envelope, then back at him, but before I could ask anything, he gave a short nod and stepped away. His footsteps faded into the crowd, and within moments he was gone. My heart began to race. I glanced quickly toward the stage. My father was deep in conversation with a senator, my mother adjusting Charlotte's gown for photographs no one had seen. I laid my hand over the envelope, feeling the firm edges through the paper. My name, Lauren Hale, was written in bold, even letters across the front. I turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into my lap beneath the tablecloth. The paper was thick, expensive. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were several folded documents stamped with a seal I recognized instantly, the McKinley Hale Group insignia embossed in dark blue. The words at the top blurred for a second before they came into focus. Transfer of ownership. My name appeared again, printed in black ink beside the words, "Majority shareholder, 51%. My pulse thudded in my ears. Page after page detailed trusts, accounts, and the legal transfer of assets, all bearing my grandfather, Arthur McKinley's signature. The final sheet was a letter in his handwriting, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times on cards and notes he used to send. The edges of the paper were faintly yellowed, and I could smell the trace of the herbal tea he used to drink. His message began simply, "If you're reading this, Lauren, the moment I spoke of has arrived." My hands shook as I read each line. He wrote that he had watched my sister's rise and my parents' pride, but also their blindness. He said that humility and compassion were rarer than ambition, and that true strength came from listening, not from speaking the loudest. He wrote, "You've lived unseen, but you have the kind of heart this family has forgotten how to value. That's why I leave what I built in your hands." The words blurred as tears gathered in my eyes, though I blinked them away quickly. I read the letter again to be sure I hadn't imagined it. My grandfather had not only seen me, he had chosen me. The company, the mansion, the shares, all of it. My pulse steadied a slow thrum of disbelief, giving way to something firmer. Around me, laughter swelled again, my father's deep voice booming from the microphone as he began another toast. Charlotte's name echoed through the speakers, the crowd's response warm and familiar. I folded the document, slipped them back into the envelope, and rested my palm over it. The weight of it was unlike anything I'd ever felt, heavy, certain and real. My grandfather's words replayed in my mind. "The moment I spoke of has arrived." The rest of the ballroom might have been wrapped in glitter and sound, but in that small corner a quiet shift had already begun. I sat still, breath shallow, letting the truth settle until it filled every corner of me. The orchestra started a new piece, slower now, a waltz that gathered couples to the center of the room. My mother waved for the photographers, my father guiding Charlotte to the dance floor for their turn beneath the spotlight. I watched them glide in practiced circles, their laughter rising above the music. They didn't know that the foundation beneath their feet had already changed. I pressed the envelope against my chest for a brief moment, hidden beneath the folds of my dress, then slipped it into my clutch. I wasn't ready to speak yet, not here, not while the applause still belonged to someone else. But deep down, I knew silence wouldn't last forever. The time my grandfather had promised had come, and sooner or later I would have to stand up and claim it. When the final note of the waltz faded and the applause began again, I drew a slow breath and stood from my chair. My father's eyes flicked toward me for an instant, irritation crossing his face at the interruption. I didn't move closer yet. I only straightened my shoulders and looked toward the stage, letting him see that I was done sitting in the shadows. The music swelled again, bright and full. Somewhere behind it, I thought I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, calm, patient, steady, as it had been on his porch in Boston. "One day, you'll know when to stand." The thought carried me forward a single step. Tomorrow, I told myself the truth would have to be spoken, and when it was nothing in that room or in our family would ever be the same again. When the applause finally faded, the room began to stir again, the sound of polite laughter spilling over the hum of the orchestra. I stood where I was for a long moment, the envelope still tucked safely in my clutch, its weight steady against my hand. My father was making his rounds across the tables, shaking hands, his voice carrying that deep note of authority he reserved for moments he wanted everyone to remember. My mother followed close behind her, smile fixed perfectly in place. Charlotte remained surrounded by guests, the center of every photograph, her laughter bright and practiced. I could see flashes from the cameras reflecting off the crystal chandeliers, small bursts of light that felt almost too sharp to look at. I eased away from my table, weaving quietly between servers carrying trays of wine. The noise of the crowd dulled as I stepped into the corridor outside the ballroom. The marble floors stretched long and cold beneath the soft glow of recessed lights. I needed the air, the quiet. My pulse had been drumming in my ears ever since the man handed me that envelope, and now away from the clinking glasses and the crowd, I could finally breathe. I found a small alcove near a tall window overlooking the city, where the lights of Manhattan spread out like a living map below. I pressed my hand over my clutch and thought of my grandfather, his porch in Boston, the scent of lilacs, the way he always listened before speaking. His letter had felt like hearing him again after years of silence. But there was something else stirring under the calm of his words, something that had waited a long time to surface. I remembered him telling me, "One day, you'll know when it's time to stand." That sentence spoken years ago had lingered in my memory without meaning until tonight. I turned back toward the ballroom. Through the tall double doors, I could still see the shimmer of gowns and tuxedos, the soft blur of movement beneath the chandeliers. My father had taken the stage again, speaking animatedly about growth and legacy. His voice carried that unshakable rhythm of certainty. My mother's laughter floated through the room at the right moments, and Charlotte stood beside him glowing beneath the spotlight. I stayed by the door, half hidden behind the drapes, watching the familiar pattern play out again, the same pattern that had ruled every family dinner, every photo, every holiday. The truth pressed against me like a heartbeat I could no longer ignore. I had spent years trying to make myself smaller, hoping that obedience might one day turn into belonging. But the letter in my clutch changed everything. It wasn't a gift, it was a responsibility. My grandfather had chosen me not to punish anyone, but because he had believed in something I couldn't yet see in myself. And as I stood there watching the people who had called me less than, I began to understand that silence would no longer protect me. The orchestra changed tempo, the notes lighter, now signaling another toast. I stepped back into the room. A few heads turned in my direction, maybe surprised to see me moving toward the stage. I heard a few whispers, nothing clear, just the sound of curiosity brushing through the crowd. My father noticed me almost immediately. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of annoyance cross his eyes, the kind that said I was stepping somewhere I didn't belong. He leaned toward my mother and muttered something, then straightened as I continued forward. The walk across the ballroom felt longer than it really was. My heels clicked softly on the polished floor, steady and sure. The room seemed to quiet as I reached the foot of the stage. My father was mid-sentence when he saw me stop there, and for a moment he faltered. The silence stretched just long enough for the music to fade completely. Every face turned toward me, waiting. "Lauren," my father said finally, his tone tight. "Is something wrong?" His hand gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles pale under the stage lights. I took a breath. "Not wrong," I said quietly, "just overdue." A few murmurs rippled through the guests, confusion mingling with curiosity. I stepped onto the first stair, leading to the stage, my pulse loud in my ears. My mother's smile froze. "Lauren, sweetheart," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp beneath it. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I replied, lifting the envelope. My hands didn't shake. The soft paper glowed faintly under the chandeliers. "Grandfather Arthur wanted this to be opened tonight." My father's jaw tightened. "That can wait until morning," he said flatly. "We're celebrating your sister." I met his eyes. It was meant for me. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the noise dissolving into uneasy silence. I laid the envelope on the podium beside him and slid the documents out the seal, catching the light. "Arthur McKinley transferred ownership of McKinley Hale Group to me before he retired." I said, my voice calm, clear. 51% including the trust accounts and the family estate. My father's face went still, drained of color. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Charlotte took a step forward, her voice trembling. "That's not true," she said sharply. "You're lying." I unfolded the letter, the one written in my grandfather's familiar hand, and held it up for everyone to see. "He left a message," I said quietly. "I think he wanted it read here." "Lauren," my father warned, his voice low but dangerous. "Stop this nonsense." I ignored him. My eyes traced the words as I spoke. "You've lived unseen, Lauren, but the strength you carry is what built this family in the first place. Wealth can be rebuilt. Character cannot. I trust you to remember that." The room stayed utterly still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above the sound of someone shifting in their chair. Charlotte's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tight. My father reached for the papers, but I stepped back. "They're notarized," I said. "He signed them 2 years ago with his attorney present. There's no mistake." My mother found her voice then soft but trembling. "Lauren," she said, "your grandfather loved you, but he couldn't have meant to divide the family." "He didn't," I said, meeting her eyes. "He meant to rebuild it." Someone near the front table gasped softly. My father's control cracked just enough for his voice to rise. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're embarrassing yourself and us in front of our entire network." I looked out over the crowd, the faces of investors, employees, and guests frozen in uncertainty. "Maybe," I said, "but the truth deserves a voice, even if it isn't the one you expected." Charlotte stepped forward, then her voice shaking. "You think this changes who you are," she said. "You'll still never be me." I met her gaze steadily. "I don't need to be." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then from the back of the room came the slow, deliberate sound of a cane tapping against the floor. Heads turned as my grandfather entered, his posture straight, despite his years, his presence quiet but commanding. The sight of him drew an audible gasp from several tables. He hadn't been seen in public for months. He reached the stage, nodding briefly to the staff, who hurried to make space for him. My father started to speak, but he lifted a hand, silencing him. "I know what she said," my grandfather's voice carried clearly, deep but calm. "And it's true." The weight of the room shifted instantly. My father's expression crumbled. My mother's eyes shimmered, caught between disbelief and realization. My grandfather stepped beside me, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. "I signed those documents myself," he said. "I did so because I believe Lauren understands what this family forgot." He looked out across the crowd, his gaze moving slowly from table to table. "Success without humility is rot," he said, "and I will not let rot take what I built." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Even the orchestra had fallen still. Then from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound grew spreading across the room until the applause filled the air again, louder and truer than before. My grandfather turned to me and gave a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile on his face. My heart lifted with something I hadn't felt in years, certainty. Beside us, Charlotte stared at the document still resting on the podium, her expression unreadable. My father lowered his eyes, his jaw clenched, the authority he carried, slipping quietly away. As the applause continued, I looked out over the room and saw faces I had never noticed before. The employees who stood near the walls, the assistants who had spent years overlooked. Their smiles were small, but real, and in that moment I understood that this was only the beginning. When the sound finally began to fade, my grandfather leaned closer and said softly, "Now you stand where you belong." I nodded, the noise of the crowd fading into a steady hum. Whatever came next would not be easy, but it would be honest, and for the first time, that was enough. When the applause faded into a hush, my grandfather remained standing beside me, his cane steady against the polished floor. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His words carried a calm weight that filled the entire room. "What we build," he said, "means nothing if we forget why we started." His gaze traveled slowly across the crowd. Board members, investors, family, friends, each one frozen under the steady conviction in his voice. I could feel the tension breaking apart, the same way a storm begins to lose its grip after lightning fades. My father's hand still rested on the podium, but the certainty that had always surrounded him was gone. My mother stood slightly behind him, her eyes darting between my grandfather and me, as if searching for a script that no longer existed. Charlotte's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tight against 1,000 unspoken words. My grandfather turned toward me, his expression softening. "You've carried the weight quietly," he said, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Now carry it with strength." Then to the room he continued, "Lauren will lead the McKinley-Hale Group from this day forward. This company will stand again on honesty, not ego." There was no applause at first, just silence, the kind that settles when people sense that something has permanently shifted. Then slowly one of the younger managers at the back began to clap, followed by another, until the sound rolled forward like a steady tide. My father's jaw tightened, his hand dropping from the podium. He looked down for a moment, then straightened his shoulders, as if holding on to the last piece of pride he could. My mother lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable. When my grandfather finished speaking, he gestured for the orchestra to play again. The music returned soft and uncertain at first, then smoother as people began to move and talk quietly. The night had changed direction, but no one seemed to know where to go next. I stood beside my grandfather as he thanked the guests who approached to shake his hand. Their smiles were cautious, respectful. Each glance toward me carried curiosity, and something else, a quiet recognition of what they had just witnessed. A few moments later, my father turned toward me. His voice was low, controlled. "You've made your point," he said, barely moving his lips. "But you've also humiliated your family." I met his eyes and said nothing. He waited for a reaction that didn't come, then took my mother's arm and led her through the nearest side door, the echo of their footsteps fading down the hall. Charlotte didn't follow. She remained near the edge of the stage, her hands gripping the railing. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with disbelief. "You planned this," she whispered. "You and Grandpa." "No," I said quietly. "He did. I just didn't stop it." Her voice trembled. "You think this makes you better?" I shook my head. "No. It just means I'm not invisible anymore." For a long moment she didn't move. Then she turned and stepped off the stage, her gown sweeping behind her like a trail of broken glass. She disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the soft sound of the orchestra filling the space she left behind. My grandfather sighed, leaning slightly on his cane. "It will take time," he murmured, his voice meant for me alone. "Truth always does." I nodded, though the room still felt too large, too bright, too full of eyes. He guided me to a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the city. From there we could see the lights of Manhattan glowing against the night, their reflection shimmering across the glass like scattered stars. They won't forgive easily, I said softly. Forgiveness isn't the goal, he replied. Understanding is. Let them have time to see what you see. He motioned for 2 glasses of water from a passing waiter and raised his lightly toward me. You did what needed to be done, he said. Your voice is what I've been waiting to hear all these years. I looked at him, the man who had once knelt beside me as a child and told me to draw what I felt instead of what I saw. He had always understood silence not as weakness, but as space, waiting to be filled by something worth saying. Tonight, that space had finally found its sound. Across the room, a few guests began to leave. The ones who stayed looked more at ease now, chatting quietly in small circles. Among them were employees, faces I recognized from company gatherings, the kind who rarely spoke up in meetings. They looked at me differently now, not as the quiet daughter of a powerful man, but as someone they might finally approach. One of them, a woman named Janet Perez, who managed the operations team, walked over hesitantly. Ms. Hale, she said softly. Or should I say Ms. McKinley? Lauren is fine, I answered. She smiled, her relief visible. Then Lauren, it's good to finally see someone up there who listens. It's what we've needed. Her words stayed with me long after she stepped away. I thought of the years I had spent working in silence, watching others take credit, convincing myself that invisibility was safer than confrontation. Maybe my grandfather had seen what I couldn't, that strength wasn't built in the spotlight, but in the shadows where no one expects it. The rest of the evening moved slowly toward its end. The orchestra packed their instruments, the lights dimmed, and the last of the guests offered polite farewells. My grandfather stayed until the final hand was shaken, then turned to me. You should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will ask for more from you than tonight did. We walked out together through the hotel's glass doors into the cool night. The noise of the city folded around us, horns in the distance, footsteps on wet pavement, the hum of traffic heading north. My grandfather paused under the awning, breathing in the night air. It feels good, he said quietly, to see the truth stand on its own. A black car waited at the curb for him. Before stepping inside, he turned to me one last time. You don't need to fight them, he said. You just need to stay steady. That's what wins in the end. I nodded, his words settling somewhere deep inside, the way only his could. He gave my hand a light squeeze, then climbed into the car, his driver closing the door behind him. I stood there until the taillights disappeared into the stream of traffic. When I finally turned toward the sidewalk, the hotel behind me looked different, smaller somehow, its golden lights fading into the distance. I walked toward the corner where the city opened wide again, its noise rising like a steady heartbeat. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward it. Back in my apartment that night, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table beside a cup of tea. The city lights spilled through the window, reflecting off the papers, inside the ink, catching faint glints of silver. I read my grandfather's letter again, tracing the lines where his pen had pressed hardest. You know humility, and that will keep you steady when others fall apart. I closed the letter carefully and looked out across the city. Somewhere below, people were still awake, still working, still trying to find their way. For years, I had measured myself against the people who overlooked me. Now I understood that the measure wasn't theirs to give. A soft chime from my phone drew my attention. It was a message from Charlotte, just 3 words, "We need to talk." I stared at it for a moment, unsure what she might say, then set the phone aside. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the first hint of morning brushed against the horizon. The streets glowed faintly, as if the whole city was exhaling. I stayed by the window until the sun began to rise, painting gold across the rooftops. Whatever waited beyond that text beyond tomorrow didn't scare me anymore. The time my grandfather had promised had come, and now it was mine to keep. The morning after the gala arrived, quiet and gray, the kind of light that filters through city clouds before the day fully wakes. I hadn't slept much. The events of the night kept replaying in my head, the flash of cameras. My father's anger, my grandfather's calm hand steadying mine. The truth was out, and yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of something heavier, something that now rested entirely on my shoulders. When I reached the company's headquarters, the lobby buzzed louder than usual. Conversations stopped when I walked in, only to resume in hushed tones as I passed. A few employees greeted me with cautious smiles. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Janet, the operations manager I'd met the night before, stood waiting near the elevators, a folder tucked under her arm. "They're already in the boardroom," she said quietly. "Your father called an emergency meeting." The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, each floor lighting up in slow succession. By the time the doors opened, I could hear voices spilling into the hallway, sharp-clipped overlapping. When I stepped inside, a dozen faces turned toward me. At the head of the table sat my father, his expression composed but cold. My mother was beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Lauren," he said, his tone even, but edged with steel. "You've caused quite a stir." I set my bag down and met his eyes. "I didn't cause anything, Dad. Grandfather made his choice." He gave a short, dry laugh. "Don't kid yourself. You ambushed me in front of clients and investors. That isn't leadership, it's spectacle." My mother leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "Your grandfather's not well, sweetheart. Maybe he's been persuaded to make decisions that don't reflect what's best for the family." I looked between them, trying to decide which part hurt more, the disbelief or the pretense of concern. "He signed everything 2 years ago," I said. "His attorney confirmed it. There was no persuasion, Mom, just trust." Across the table, one of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Regardless of how this came about," he said carefully, "we have a company to run. The shares are one thing, but leadership requires continuity. We can't just replace Mr. Hale overnight." My father nodded, his gaze steady on me. "Exactly. You don't understand what it takes to keep this business alive. You've never been part of it." Janet, seated near the end of the table, spoke up. "That's not true, sir. She's been part of it longer than most of us realized, just in different ways." All eyes turned to her, surprise flickering across a few faces. She straightened under their attention. "Lauren's been volunteering with several of our outreach projects for years, the same ones we highlight in our annual reports. She's already represented this company's name out there, just without taking credit." My father's jaw tightened. "That's irrelevant." "It's not," Janet replied gently. "It's the kind of leadership people notice now." For a moment, no one spoke. Then my grandfather's attorney, Mr. Connors, stepped into the room. He carried a slim briefcase and a folder marked with the company seal. "If I may," he said, setting the papers on the table. "Arthur McKinley asked me to deliver this in the event of any confusion." My father's face darkened, but he said nothing. Mr. Connors opened the folder and read aloud. "Effective immediately, the majority shareholder, Ms. Lauren Hale, assumes executive authority over all corporate operations. Mr. Thomas Hale will retain a consultative role for a transitional period not exceeding 6 months." The words landed like a gavel strike. My mother's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide. My father leaned back slowly, his silence thicker than anger. Around the table, whispers rose and fell like the soft tide of a room trying to adjust to a new order. When the meeting ended, my father stood abruptly. "You've made your bed?" he said, his voice quiet but heavy. "Let's see how you managed to sleep in it." He walked past me without another glance. My mother followed, hesitating only long enough to say, "This isn't over." The door closed behind them, leaving me alone with the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Janet lingered near the doorway. "You handled that better than most, Wood," she said softly. "I'm not sure what I handled," I admitted. She smiled faintly. "The beginning of something different. They'll resist it, but they'll learn." Over the next few weeks, the office shifted around me. Some departments welcomed change. Others resisted with quiet defiance. My father still came in occasionally, offering advice that sounded more like warnings. My mother avoided me entirely. Charlotte, however, stayed silent. I hadn't heard from her since the night she texted. It was a crisp morning when she finally appeared at my office door. She didn't knock, just stepped inside and closed it behind her. "You've turned everything upside down," she said. Her tone controlled, but brittle. I gestured to the chair across from me. "I didn't plan any of this, Charlotte. You know that." She sat, but didn't relax. "You think I don't see what you're doing? You're trying to play savior? Fix the family, fix the company, fix everything Grandpa built. I'm trying to honor what he wanted, I said. She looked down, twisting her bracelet. He was supposed to choose me, she whispered. Dad always said I'd be the one. I know, I said quietly, and I know what it's like to believe that and be wrong. Her eyes lifted sharp and wounded. For a moment I saw the sister I'd grown up chasing, confident, adored, certain of her place. But behind the anger, there was fear. They won't forgive you, she said. Maybe not, I replied. But this isn't about forgiveness. It's about doing what's right. She stood, her composure cracking just enough for her voice to tremble. You'll regret this, Lauren. You think you've won, but you've only traded one kind of control for another. Before I could answer, she turned and left. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the quiet office sharper than I expected. That afternoon, I met with the department heads. We sat around the same table that had witnessed so many years of silence and formality. This time, the air felt different. I spoke plainly about transparency, about recentering the company's focus on its people rather than prestige. Some nodded, others looked uncertain, but no one interrupted. Later, as I left the building, the sunset reflected off the glass towers, washing the street in amber light. I thought of my grandfather's porch in Boston, of the lilacs that always bloomed late but bright. He had once told me that patience wasn't waiting. It was steady motion towards something worth the time. Back at home, I poured tea and sat by the window. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from my grandfather's nurse saying he wanted to see me the next morning. The knot in my chest eased a little at the thought. Maybe he sensed what was coming before I did. The city outside was still alive, headlights threading through the streets, voices blending into the rhythm of traffic below. Somewhere in that hum, I could almost hear his words again. Stay steady. I watched the lights flicker across the glass, the world still turning, the night still open with what waited ahead. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. The morning air in Boston carried a quiet chill when I arrived at my grandfather's house. The garden still bloomed with late lilacs, their scent familiar even in the early hour. His nurse Martha greeted me at the door, her face softened by the kind of patience only years of caregiving can teach. "He's been waiting for you," she said. Had me set the tea out on the porch, just like old times. I walked through the hall lined with framed photos, some fading, some recent. There were pictures of my mother and father in their younger years of Charlotte at piano recitals, and a few of me tucked near the end of the row. My grandfather had once told me he arranged them himself, not by order of pride, but by memory, each moment placed exactly where it felt right. When I stepped onto the porch, he was sitting in his usual chair, a thick blanket draped over his knees. The cane rested by his side, untouched. He turned his head slowly when he heard me and smiled. "I knew you'd come early," he said, his voice low but steady. "You always did like quiet mornings." I sat beside him, pouring 2 cups of tea. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than they think," he said, his eyes glinting. Not as strong as I once was, but still stubborn enough to keep everyone worried. We both smiled. The sun was just beginning to rise, the light catching the edges of the lilac bushes that framed the yard. For a while we didn't speak. The silence between us had never been heavy. It was the kind that felt like rest. After a few minutes, he said softly, "I heard about the meeting, about Thomas and Diane. They weren't happy," I said, keeping my voice even. I expected that he replied, "When people build their lives on control, truth feels like theft." He took a slow sip of tea, his hand trembling slightly. "I didn't choose you because I wanted to punish anyone, Lauren. I chose you because you listen. You see people. This company, our family, needs that now more than ever." I nodded, unsure if I could find the right words. "I'm trying to make it right," I said. "But every step feels like walking across thin ice." He smiled faintly. "That's how real change always feels." Then, after a pause, he added, "There's something else I wanted you to have." He gestured to the small wooden box on the table beside him. I opened it carefully. Inside were 2 things, a folded letter and a small silver compass, its glass slightly scratched with age. "This was mine," he said. "Kept it with me when I started McKinley Hale. Whenever I felt lost, I'd look at it, even though it doesn't point to anything that matters in business. It just reminded me to find my direction again." I traced my thumb along the cool edge of the compass. and the letter. "For later," he said quietly, "when you need it most." I tucked the box safely into my bag. He leaned back, his eyes on the horizon. "You've already done what I hoped you would," he said. "You stood up. The rest will take time." We sat together until the morning grew brighter, the city sounds starting to rise in the distance. Before I left, he reached for my hand. "Promise me one thing, Lauren," he said. "Don't let bitterness fill the space where peace should grow." I knotted my throat tight. "I promise." He smiled, satisfied. "Good. Then I can rest easy." 2 weeks later, I got the call. Martha's voice was calm, but I heard the weight in it. "He passed in his sleep early this morning," she said. It was peaceful. For a moment, everything went still. The line between the past and the present blurred. His voice echoed in my mind, like the faint sound of a door closing softly behind him. The funeral was small, just family, a few close friends, and some longtime employees. It was held at St. Andrew's, the same chapel where my grandmother's service had been years before. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with that strange stillness that only arrives when the world feels slightly rearranged. Charlotte arrived with our parents. She avoided my eyes, standing close to them, as if she needed their approval to breathe. My mother's hand rested on Charlotte's arm the entire time, her expression polished, composed. My father nodded stiffly at me before turning away. When it came time to speak, I stepped up to the podium. The wood felt cool beneath my hands. I didn't prepare notes. Instead, I told a story about my grandfather's garden, the way he used to kneel among the lilacs, dirt on his hands, telling me that tending to something small every day could change the whole landscape over time. I saw a few people smile, even through their tears. As I finished, I glanced toward my family. My father's expression didn't change, but my mother blinked quickly. Her lips pressed together. Charlotte looked down her shoulders tight, her hands twisting a handkerchief. After the service, people gathered outside under the gray sky. A soft wind stirred the trees, scattering petals from the nearby magnolia. Janet approached quietly, placing a small bouquet on the stone. "He was proud of you," she said. I thanked her, my voice barely a whisper. Later, as the crowd thinned, Charlotte walked over. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but her voice held no anger this time. "He loved you differently," she said. "He loved us both," I replied, "just in ways we didn't understand." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward our parents standing by the car. "They won't stop fighting you," she said. "Dad's already talking about challenging the transfer." "I know," I said quietly, "but I have everything documented. Grandfather made sure of it." Charlotte looked back at me, her expression softer than it had been in months. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "Start by not fighting," I said. "That's what he wanted." Her eyes glistened, and for the first time since this all began, she didn't look like my rival. She just looked like my sister. That evening I returned to Boston one last time to settle his affairs. Martha met me at the door and handed me a sealed envelope. "He left this for you," she said. It was the letter from the wooden box. I sat down on the porch before opening it, the scent of lilacs faint in the air, even after dusk. The paper was lined with his familiar handwriting. "Lauren, if this finds you, I'm already where peace no longer needs protecting. You'll face storms, some loud, some quiet. When they come, don't anchor yourself to anger. Use the compass. It won't point north, it will point home. Home isn't a place. It's who you choose to be when no one's watching." By the time I reached the end, the ink had blurred slightly under my tears. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, closing it with a quiet click. The porch light flickered as the wind passed through the garden. Somewhere nearby, a single lilac branch bent and released its last bloom of the season. I sat there until the air turned cold, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. When I finally stood, the house behind me seemed smaller, its silence peaceful rather than empty. The world had changed again, but this time it felt like a door opening instead of closing. As I stepped down from the porch, I looked toward the road where the city lights glowed faintly in the distance. Whatever waited beyond them would carry his voice somewhere in it. Tomorrow, I would return to New York, to the company, to whatever battles lay ahead. But tonight, I let the quiet hold me a little longer, steady, grounded, and ready to begin again. The weeks after my grandfather's funeral passed in a blur of paperwork meetings and long hours that seemed to stretch endlessly. His absence hung over everything like a soft echo I couldn't escape. The office still carried the faint trace of his presence, his framed photograph in the hallway, his old leather chair that I hadn't yet moved. People spoke about him in lowered voices, as if saying his name too loudly might disturb the calm he'd left behind. The company began to shift under the new leadership plan he'd set in motion. We implemented policies he'd drafted years earlier, but never had the chance to see through better benefits for employees, more transparency with investors, and the reinstatement of a scholarship program he'd once championed. There was resistance, of course. Change always found its critics. But there was also something new stirring in the halls, something lighter. People were starting to believe again. One afternoon, while reviewing proposals with Janet, my assistant handed me a note. "Your father's here," she whispered. He didn't call ahead. Janet looked up from the reports. "Do you want me to stay?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." When my father entered, he closed the door behind him but didn't sit down. He stood by the window staring at the city below. The gray light caught the lines around his eyes, making him look older than I remembered. "You've been busy," he said. "There's a lot to fix," I replied. He turned, then his expression unreadable. "You think you can undo 40 years of work overnight?" "No," I said softly, "but I can start doing it differently." He let out a long breath, the kind that carried more weariness than anger. "Your grandfather loved this company more than his own family. You inherited that same obsession." I met his gaze. I inherited his sense of responsibility. He studied me for a moment before walking to the chair opposite my desk. "You think I don't see what's happening?" he asked. "The employees adore you. Investors are calling you a fresh start. But all I see is a child trying to control something she doesn't fully understand." I didn't answer. The old rhythm between us was returning, the same one that had defined every argument we'd ever had. Silence followed by challenge, challenge, followed by dismissal. Finally, he leaned forward. "Sell your shares back to me," he said. "We'll make it clean. You'll get more than enough to build your own future without this burden." I felt my jaw tighten. "It's not for sale, Dad." He stood abruptly. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said quietly, "but I'll regret it more if I give up what he trusted me with." He paused by the door, his hand resting on the handle. "You've turned my father's company into a stage for your righteousness," he said. "And when it collapses, don't expect me to pick up the pieces." Then he left, the sound of the door closing sharp against the quiet room. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers spread across my desk. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, thin and steady. I reached for the small compass my grandfather had given me and set it beside my notebook. The needle trembled faintly, not pointing north, but swaying as if it were trying to find its own path. The next few days brought a storm of activity. The press had picked up on the leadership shift, running stories that painted the company's transformation as a redemption arc. Some headlines were kind, others weren't. My father's camp tried to discredit the transition, leaking statements about inexperience at the helm. It didn't surprise me, but it still stung to see our family name tangled in public debate. One evening while I was reviewing reports, Charlotte showed up at my office. She looked tired, the sharpness that had once defined her replaced by a quiet hesitation. "You should probably know," she said, closing the door behind her. "Dad's been talking to his old partners. He wants to start a rival firm." I looked up from my desk. I figured he might. "He's using Mom's inheritance to fund it," she continued. "They're calling it Hale Strategic." I felt the faintest pull in my chest, something between sadness and inevitability. "Thank you for telling me." She nodded, then lingered by the doorway. "You're handling this better than I expected." "I've had practice," I said gently. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You sound like him." "Who, Grandpa?" she said. "The way you talk, the way you stay calm, even when everything's falling apart." It used to drive Dad crazy. There was warmth in her voice this time, not resentment. It caught me off guard. I smiled back, and for a fleeting moment the space between us didn't feel so wide. Later that week, the company hosted a memorial event in honor of my grandfather's legacy. It was held in the downtown atrium, a glass-walled space he had personally designed decades ago. The walls displayed photos of his early years, handwritten notes from employees, and framed letters of gratitude from community organizations he had quietly supported. As people gathered, I took my place at the front, beside the portrait that now stood where his chair once had. My voice was steady as I spoke about his vision, the belief that leadership meant service, that success meant integrity. The room grew still, the kind of silence that carries both loss and respect. When the event ended, a man in his 50s approached me. He introduced himself as Michael Trent, a longtime investor who had once clashed with my father. "Arthur would have been proud of this," he said. "You're restoring what made this company matter." His words stayed with me that night as I walked home through the quiet streets. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilacs, the city lights glimmering like small promises in the dark. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of balance returning. Not peace exactly, but something close. Still, part of me knew the conflict wasn't over. My father wouldn't let go easily, and neither would the past he carried. But I also knew I wasn't the same woman who once sat quietly at family dinners waiting to be seen. When I reached my apartment, I set the compass on the windowsill, its needle glinting in the street light. I remembered my grandfather's final words, "Stay steady," and realized that steadiness didn't mean standing still. It meant moving forward even through resistance. The next morning, I walked into the office to find Janet waiting with a stack of documents. "We finalized the foundation paperwork," she said, smiling. "The McKinley Trust for Future Leaders." "It's ready." I ran my hand over the embossed logo on the folder. The foundation would provide scholarships and mentorship for students who had no family connections, no open doors. It was the continuation of my grandfather's legacy, and in some quiet way my own. As I looked around the office, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the faint dust in the air. Everything felt different now, stronger, clearer, but beneath that calm, I could feel a shift coming, one last storm before the stillness. My father's words echoed faintly in my memory. "You'll regret this." I closed the folder and set it on my desk. "Let him come," I murmured to myself. The compass on the corner caught the light, its needle steady at last, as if it already knew where home was. The confrontation came quietly, not in a boardroom or courtroom, but in the narrow hallway outside my office. My father stood there, still wearing the tailored sharpness that once commanded entire rooms, though something in his posture had softened. "We need to talk," he said. I closed the door behind us and waited. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed faintly through the glass, and the faint scent of rain drifted in through the cracked window. Finally, he drew in a slow breath. "You did what I couldn't," he said. "You turned it back into what it was meant to be." It wasn't an apology, not in words, but I heard what he couldn't quite say. His pride had built walls too high for regret to climb over, but for the first time I saw the cracks where light could slip through. "I didn't do it alone," I said. "Grandpa left a map. I just followed it." He looked away, his voice rougher when he spoke again. "I spent years trying to make this company something the world respected. Somewhere along the way, I forgot to respect the people inside it." He let the words hang there before adding quietly, "including you." Something eased in my chest. I didn't need him to explain or justify anymore. Silence filled the space where arguments used to live, and somehow that silence felt like peace. When he left, he didn't shake my hand or promise to stay in touch. He just nodded once, a gesture that said, "Enough." That afternoon, I watched from the window as he walked down the sidewalk alone, his reflection shrinking against the glass until the crowd folded around him. A month later, McKinley Hale held its first employee summit under the new leadership. The auditorium was full over 200 people, some who'd been there since the company began, others just starting their first year. We unveiled the foundation's first scholarship recipients that day, students whose names would have meant nothing to investors, but everything to the kind of future my grandfather had imagined. Charlotte helped coordinate the event. She moved through the crowd with a quiet professionalism I hadn't seen in her before. When it was over, she lingered as the room emptied, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You made it work," she said. "We made it work," I corrected. Her eyes softened. "I don't know where I fit in yet." "You'll figure it out," I said. "Just start by being honest with them, with yourself." She nodded slowly. Before she turned to leave, she reached for my hand, squeezing it once. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the months that followed, the company changed in small, steady ways. Office doors stayed open longer. Decisions took longer because more voices were heard and people smiled more often in the hallways. The balance sheets still mattered, but so did the morning check-ins, the handwritten thank you notes, and the quiet celebrations of work, well done. Janet became my right hand, guiding operations with a calm wisdom that kept everything grounded. Michael joined the advisory board, helping us navigate the new wave of investors drawn to the company's renewed purpose. The scholarship fund grew faster than any of us expected. Every few weeks, I'd receive handwritten letters from students, some first-generation college kids, some returning mothers, all carrying a piece of the dream my grandfather started. On evenings when the office grew quiet, I'd take out the small compass and place it on my desk. The needle trembled, then steadied, pointing somewhere unseen, but sure. It reminded me that direction wasn't about knowing where to go, but trusting the steps that brought you there. One night, I stopped by my parents' house for the first time in nearly a year. My mother met me at the door, her expression wary at first, then softening. The dining room looked the same: long table, polished silver, the same portrait of my father hanging near the mantel. She poured coffee for both of us, her movements, careful, deliberate. "I heard about the foundation," she said quietly. "Your grandfather would have been proud." I smiled faintly. "He taught me everything I know." She looked down at her cup, then back at me. "We weren't kind to you. I thought being hard would make you stronger. I didn't realize you already were. It wasn't an apology either, not exactly, but it was enough. Sometimes peace doesn't come as a grand moment. It comes in small, steady breaths." As I drove home that night, the city stretched out ahead of me, lights shimmering across the skyline. The company was thriving, the family slowly mending, and for the first time I didn't feel like I was chasing anyone's approval. I was simply moving forward, steady and unhurried. In the morning, the sun rose through the tall windows of my office, casting a pale gold glow over the compass. I traced my thumb across its worn edge, thinking of the letter my grandfather left. Home isn't a place. It's who you choose to be when no one's watching. I finally understood what he meant. I didn't need a seat at anyone's table to prove my worth. I had built my own, and there was room at it for anyone willing to show up with honesty and grace. As the day began, I looked out across the city and whispered a quiet thank you to him, to the lessons, to every moment that had broken and rebuilt me. The world didn't feel as heavy anymore. It just felt real. And for anyone listening now who's ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or told they were less than enough, remember this: sometimes being underestimated is the best beginning you'll ever have. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And maybe take a moment today to look around, see who's sitting quietly at the edge of the table, and remind them they matter too.